first thing anyone noticed about Sergeant Vayle was her hands. Not the rifle slung across her back, not the rank insignia on her collar. Her hands, the way they stayed completely still when everything around her was moving. When the transport rattled through a crosswind somewhere over the Beaufort Sea and half the platoon braced against the fuselage, Vayle just sat with her palms flat on her knees, eyes closed, not sleeping, calculating something no one else could see. Staff Sergeant Cormack noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He noticed, filed it away, and went back to his pre-op checklist the way a man does when he's already decided what he thinks and doesn't want new information complicating the picture. That was November. By February, Vayle had been quietly reassigned to Forward Operating Base, Resolute, a cold-weather reconnaissance station perched on the edge of nowhere in the Northwest Territories, nominally supporting joint exercises between the U.S. Army and Canadian Rangers. The assignment came with no explanation and no ceremony. A folder slid across a desk, a set of coordinates, a departure time. She packed in 11 minutes. She'd done it faster. FOB Resolute was smaller than it sounded. A cluster of modular buildings behind double wire, a motor pool that smelled permanently of diesel and frozen mud, and a command tent large enough to hold a briefing for 16 if nobody moved their elbows. The Rangers who operated out of there were good, quiet professionals who'd spent careers learning to read terrain the way other people read weather. They didn't posture. They didn't make speeches. They shook Vayle's hand when she arrived, pointed her toward the bunk allocation, and went back to what they were doing. The Americans were a different story. There were 7 of them attached to the joint exercise. A reconnaissance evaluation team sent up from Fort Wainwright to run cold weather assessment drills alongside the Canadian unit. They'd arrived 3 days before Vayle, long enough to establish a dynamic to find the edges of the space and claim them. Their team lead was a warrant officer named Gresh, mid-40s, combat-weathered, the kind of man who'd earned every callus on his hands and knew it and didn't need you to know he knew it, but somehow you did anyway. He was competent in the specific way that can calcify into assumption if no one challenges it for long enough. Gresh had already formed his opinion of the joint assignment before Vayle stepped off the helicopter. He'd formed it the moment the manifest crossed his desk and the name came with a personnel note flagging specialized long-range marksmanship training. He'd seen that note attached to plenty of names over the years. Most of them had been worth something. A few hadn't. He decided, without quite articulating it to himself, that the ratio was about to get worse. He didn't say anything directly. Men like Gresh rarely did. What he said instead, to Corporal Fenwick on the morning of Vayle's arrival, was, "Let's see how she handles the cold weather qual course." And the way he said it, the particular weight on she, carried the full freight of what he hadn't said. Fenwick laughed, not cruelly, just easily. The way you laugh when you're agreeing with something you haven't fully examined. Vayle heard it. She was 20 feet away, checking her kit against the inventory sheet, and she heard it the way she heard most things, clearly without reacting, storing it somewhere useful. She'd been hearing variations of that laugh for 6 years. The cold weather qualification course ran over 2 days. A series of timed marksmanship evaluations at progressively extending ranges, interspersed with movement drills in full winter kit through terrain that was specifically designed to exhaust your legs before you needed your hands to be steady. The conditions in November had been bad. By February, they were something else entirely. The temperature dropped to -31°C overnight and climbed to -18 by midday, which meant the air density shifted enough to change your ballistic calculations twice in a single session if you weren't adjusting constantly. Most of the evaluation team shot well enough in the morning and struggled in the afternoon. The temperature swing caught them. Their groupings opened up at distance, not dramatically, but enough to note. Gresh himself was solid out to 800 meters and inconsistent past it. He knew it and didn't make excuses. That was something in him worth respecting. Vayle shot the morning session without conversation. She set up her position with the methodical precision of someone who has made the same sequence of small decisions so many times they no longer feel like decisions, more like the natural order of things. Bipod placement, stock adjustment, scope verification against the cold altered zero. She'd reestablished at dawn. She lay in the snow for 40 minutes before the first target appeared, and she did not move in a way that attracted attention. The results from the morning session came back through the rangemaster before lunch. Vayle had shot a clean first-round hit at every distance, including a wind-adjusted engagement at 1,140 meters that the rangemaster read twice before he read it aloud. Fenwick said nothing. Gresh looked at the paper for a moment, then set it face down on the table, and said they'd see how the afternoon went. The afternoon went the same way. Afterward, in the debrief, one of the younger members of the evaluation team, a specialist named Price, who was 23 and hadn't yet learned to be careful about what he said in front of people who outranked him, asked Vayle what her process was at the longer ranges. He asked it the way someone asks a question when they're genuinely curious and haven't thought about how the question sounds. Vayle looked at him for a moment. Wind, air, temperature, distance, she said. In that order every time. Price nodded. What about when two of them are pulling against each other? Then you decide which one's lying, she said, and you trust the other one. Price thought about that. He seemed to find it satisfying. Gresh, across the room, said nothing, but something in the set of his jaw shifted in a way that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite resistance. It was something in between, the preliminary movement of a man beginning, very slowly, to revise. He didn't get there yet. He wasn't the kind of man who got there quickly. The joint exercise was scheduled to run for 3 weeks. By the end of the first week, a pattern had established itself that everyone could see and nobody named directly. In the field, when decisions needed to be made under pressure, the evaluation team deferred to Gresh. In the formal briefings, Gresh set the agenda. In the informal spaces, the mess tent after evening meal, the brief window between last light and sleep, when people talk without their guard up. Vayle was present and quiet, and occasionally said something that stuck with you long after you'd moved on to the next thing. The Canadian Rangers noticed her. Warrant Officer Gresh, who ran their reconnaissance section, had been doing this for 19 years and had a particular ability to see past rank and posture to the thing underneath. He started consulting her, casually, in the way experienced people consult each other when they recognize competence, without needing to make a ceremony of it. He'd drop a topographic problem on the table and look at it for a moment, and then look at her, and she'd identify the issue and he'd nod, and that would be the end of it. Gresh saw it. It bothered him in a way he wouldn't have been able to fully articulate. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was something more uncomfortable. The early stages of recognizing that the frame you've been using to understand a situation might not be the right frame. He dealt with it by increasing the difficulty of the qualification standards. It was within his authority to do so. The evaluation parameters had a built-in flexibility for commander adjustment, and Gresh exercised it on day 9 by announcing a supplemental long-range assessment under full operational simulation conditions. Degraded visibility, moving targets, time pressure, cold-soaked equipment, the kind of test that was designed to expose the gap between range performance and real-world capability. Nobody said out loud that it was aimed at Vayle. Nobody needed to. Vayle found out about the supplemental assessment at a 600 on day 9, 40 minutes before it was scheduled to begin. She'd been awake since 0430, working through a maintenance cycle on her rifle that she ran every third day, regardless of operational tempo. Not because the rifle required it, but because the ritual of it kept her connected to the machine in a way she'd learned to trust over distance. She heard Gresh give the announcement. She heard the way he gave it, the particular flatness of a man who believes he's being objective. She set down her cleaning cloth, completed the function check, and slung the rifle. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Gresh looked at her for a moment. "Same as everyone else," he said. "Then I'm ready." The assessment ran from 0700 to 1100. Moving targets at distances ranging from 600 to 1300 meters. Intermittent heavy snowfall, reducing visibility to varying degrees. A 30-minute equipment failure simulation that required a cold reload in -26 conditions without removing gloves. The evaluation team went through it in rotation. Gresh went third. He was good. He had, as Vayle had observed from the first day, a genuine gift for reading wind. The kind that came from years of hunting before the Army, from growing up somewhere flat and open where the wind never stopped and you either learned to read it or you missed everything. He finished with an 81% first-round hit rate on the moving target series. It was the highest anyone had posted all morning. He knew it. The team knew it. There was a quiet satisfaction in the tent afterward. Vayle went last. She set up without rushing. She ran the same pre-engagement sequence she always ran, the same order, the same checks, the same stillness before the first target. Soleil watched from the observation position with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away. Price was next to him. Fenwick was on the range radio. The first target appeared at 700 meters, moving laterally at variable speed across a slope that caught the falling snow and redirected it in a way that altered the apparent wind at the target face. Vayle tracked it for 3 seconds, made an adjustment, and sent the round. Hit. The second target was stationary, partially obscured, at 950. The visibility had dropped. She waited 4 seconds before the shot, long enough that Fenwick, monitoring through binoculars, started to wonder if she'd lost the target. Then the round went, and the target dropped. She worked through the series this way, not fast, not slow, with the particular rhythm of someone who understands that speed is only useful up to the point where it starts causing accuracy, and accuracy is the only thing that actually matters. When the range master called final ceasefire and read back the results, Gresh's 81% still sat in the tent like something substantial. Then he read Vayle's number, 94. The tent was quiet for a moment in the specific way that happens when a number doesn't match the story people have been telling themselves. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was the silence of recalibration, the small, involuntary pause before a person begins the process of updating what they believe. Fenwick looked at the paper, then at Vayle, then at nothing in particular. Price said, quietly, "Huh." Gresh said nothing. He was looking at the number on the paper the way he'd looked at the first day results, with a particular quality of attention that was more than reading. He was deciding something. You could see the decision moving across his face, though he wouldn't have said that. Would have said he was just reviewing the data. What happened next mattered because of how it happened. He didn't revise loudly. Men like Gresh rarely do. What he did was 3 hours later, during the afternoon mission planning session, ask Vayle to walk through her wind reading methodology for the moving target series. Not performatively, not as a concession. He asked it the way you ask someone to explain something when you want to understand it. When the question is genuine, and you've set aside the version of yourself that doesn't ask questions. Vayle looked at him for a moment, the same measured pause she gave most things, and then she explained it. Wind, air, temperature, distance, the hierarchy she trusted. The way she weighted the lie against the truth when the inputs conflicted. The specific adjustments for snowfall that redirected apparent wind at target face. Gresh listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once, a short, deliberate movement that carried more weight than a longer one would have. "That's a better system than what I've been running," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a speech. It was a man acknowledging a fact after he'd gotten out of his own way long enough to see it clearly. In the context of what had come before, it was enough. Soleil, who'd been listening from the far end of the table, said nothing. But later, after the session, he stopped by the equipment bay, where Vayle was running her end-of-day maintenance cycle, and he stood in the doorway for a moment. "You always work on it every third day?" he said. "Every third day," she said. He nodded. "My father used to do that with his hunting rifle. Said the maintenance wasn't about the gun." He paused. "Said it was about not letting yourself forget what the gun was for." Vayle kept her eyes on the bore. He was right. Soleil left without saying anything else. That was the thing about the Rangers. They communicated at the frequency of people who'd spent long careers in silence and had learned to put weight into fewer words. The exercise entered its second week. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that would appear in an after-action report. But in the daily texture of how the joint team operated, Vayle was no longer the peripheral figure Gresh had positioned her as. She was consulted on planning. Her assessments were referenced in briefings. Price started asking her questions with the frank, unguarded curiosity of someone who's realized they've been near something worth paying attention to and wants to make the most of the time remaining. It was Price, actually, who first noticed the anomaly in the signals data. He brought it to Vayle on day 14 because he didn't fully understand what he was looking at, and she was the person he'd started going to when he didn't understand things. He laid the printout on the table in the equipment bay and pointed to a recurrence pattern in the transmission timestamps. "This is from the monitoring sweep we ran 2 nights ago," he said. "These intervals, they're not random. I thought it was equipment artifact at first, but it comes up in 3 separate collection windows." Vayle studied the paper. She studied it for a long time, not speaking, with the same quality of stillness she brought to everything that required sustained attention. Something moved across her expression, not concern exactly, Recognition, maybe. The particular look of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just found a piece of it they weren't expecting. "Where's the source triangulation on this?" she said. Price hesitated. "That's what I was going to ask you. Because the coordinates don't resolve to anything on our operational grid." She looked at the numbers. "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't." She didn't explain what she meant, not immediately. What she did was pull a secondary map from the case she kept beneath her bunk. A topographic overlay of the region extending beyond the exercise boundaries, annotated in her own handwriting with notations she'd made before leaving Fort Wainwright. She cross-referenced the transmission coordinates against her annotations. Her hand stilled over a specific point on the map. The transmission source was not inside the exercise boundary. It was not coming from any of the monitored positions. It was coming from a location that had no reason to be transmitting anything. A decommissioned relay station, 60 kilometers northeast of Fob Resolute, cataloged as inactive since 2019. Stations don't go inactive and then start transmitting on their own. She took the data to Vayle that evening. She laid it out without drama. The timestamps, the triangulation, the relay station coordinates, the pattern of transmission intervals that, when you map them against operational movement data for the past 10 days, corresponded with a precision that was not coincidence to the joint team's scheduled patrol rotations. Vayle read it twice. He set the paper down. His expression was the particular controlled stillness of a man who has seen enough to know when something is serious and has trained himself not to perform the reaction. "You know what you're suggesting," he said. "I know what the data is suggesting," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been looking at this?" "Since I arrived," she said. "I wasn't looking for this specifically. I was looking for something adjacent to it." The pause that followed had weight. "Your father," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd read her personnel file the way a careful commander reads the files of everyone attached to his unit. He knew what was in it. The incident in 2021, the investigation that had stalled and then quietly closed, the fitness for duty review that had cleared her but not fully explained why the investigation had stalled. He was running signals intelligence in a region he wasn't supposed to be monitoring, Vayle said. The report said he exceeded his mandate. The report was wrong. He wasn't exceeding his mandate. He'd found something that someone wanted buried, and the people who wanted it buried had enough reach to make the report say what they needed it to say. She paused. The pattern in that transmission data matches the encryption protocol he documented before he died. It was a protocol he believed was being used by a domestic contractor with access to classified movement schedules. He called it in. 2 weeks later, he was dead, and the investigation was attributed to equipment failure. Vayle was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the building was making the low structural sound of metal under sustained pressure. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to run the triangulation to certainty," she said, "and I need someone with the authority to make sure this doesn't get buried the same way." Vayle nodded. "Once. The same weight as before. He brought Gresh in at 2200. He laid the data on the table without editorializing and let Vayle walk them through it. Gresh listened the way he'd listened 2 days ago in the planning session, with the particular attention of a man who's gotten out of his own way. When she finished, he didn't speak immediately. He looked at the transmission pattern, the relay station coordinates, the correlation with patrol schedules. Then he said, "If this is what it looks like, we have a window of about 18 hours before the next transmission cycle." 15, Vayle said. "The intervals are compressing." Gresh looked at Vayle. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who've operated in different contexts, but recognize the same standard of conduct. "What's your assessment?" Gresh said. "She's right," Vayle said, simply, without ornamentation. Gresh nodded. He reached for his radio. What happened in the following 12 hours was the kind of operation that gets documented in careful, neutral language in official reports and doesn't fully render in that language. The cold, the precision required of movement through terrain that punished every mistake, the way communication collapsed to essentials when the wind dropped the temperature another 6 degrees, and the margin for error became very small. Vayle ran the observation element from a position northeast of the relay station, 300 meters of open slope between her and the structure, temperature -29 and dropping, wind variable, and reading dishonestly off the slope face. She lay in position for 4 hours. At 034, a vehicle appeared on the access track to the relay station. It stopped 200 meters short of the structure. Two figures exited. They moved with the particular purpose of people who have done something many times and expect to do it again. Vayle watched through her scope. She noted the equipment. She noted the sequence of their movements. She sent back a brief transmission to the command element, 4 words. The kind of brevity that lands differently than a long report. They're running it live, Biosalil's voice came back on the radio. Hold position. She held position. This was the thing people who hadn't done it didn't fully understand. That the hardest part of a long-range observation isn't the cold or the stillness or even the technical demands of the shot. The hardest part is holding position when everything in you wants to move, when the situation is evolving and your instinct is to close the distance and act. She had learned over years to understand that holding still was itself an action. That discipline exercised in silence was the same thing as force, applied precisely at the moment it was actually needed. The command element moved in at 0411. She stayed on the position until it was over. The two figures at the relay station became aware of the approach when it was too late for the approach to be contested. The equipment was secured. The transmission array was documented. The digital records stored in the relay station's secondary hard drive contained, among other things, encrypted communication logs going back to 2021, including a series of transmissions from the period immediately preceding her father's death, addressed to a contractor designation she recognized from the fragments of his investigation notes she'd spent 3 years reassembling. She didn't learn any of this until afterward, sitting in the command tent at 0610, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold by the time anyone thought to bring it to her, the sky outside doing the slow, reluctant work of getting light. Gresh came in at 0630. He sat across from her. He looked like a man who'd been awake all night, which he had, and who'd spent that time doing more than the physical task in front of him. The records are being secured through proper channels, he said. Biosalil's made the contact. It's above both our pay grades now, but it's in hands he trusts. Okay, she said. Gresh looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who wants to say something and is trying to find the version of it that is true without being inadequate to the situation. I made a judgment when you arrived, he said. I'm not going to tell you I wasn't aware I was making it. I made it anyway. He paused. That was wrong. Not just because of how it played out, because it was the wrong basis for a judgment. Vayle looked at him across the table. She had been carrying something for 3 years, not anger. Exactly, though there had been anger at the beginning. Something that had compressed over time into something harder and more functional than anger. Resolve, maybe. The particular clarity that comes from having a purpose you've refused to put down, no matter what the weight of it does to your days. She thought about her father, not the way she usually thought about him, with the careful management of someone rationing something that hurts, but openly for a moment, the way you can when the thing you've been working toward has finally shifted from the category of possible into the category of real. He had believed that doing the right thing carefully and thoroughly would be enough. He had been wrong about that. But the work he'd done, the documentation, the protocol identification, the transmission logs he'd compiled at cost, that work had survived him. It had survived the report that buried it. It had found its way to her in fragments, and she had reassembled it over 3 years, and now it was in the hands of people with the authority and the motivation to take it forward. She set down the cold coffee. The judgment, she said to Gresh, don't make it again. He held her gaze. No, he said, I won't. Outside, the light was doing what northern light does in February, not warming, exactly, but clarifying. The snow on the ridgeline caught it and held it, and the whole landscape went from gray to a kind of luminous quiet that you don't get at lower latitudes. Vayle watched it through the tent window for a moment. Biosalil appeared in the doorway. He looked at the window, then at her. Fenwick made breakfast, he said. It's not good, but it's hot. I'll take it, she said. She stood. She slung nothing. The rifle was secured, the mission was over, and walked out into the cold, into the light, into whatever came next.